The Torah mentions Kohanim and Levites, but where did the Sadducees actually emerge from? Who granted them their immense authority during the Second Temple in Jerusalem? Guardians of the temple's priestly laws, their influence defied all limits. In this documentary, you will discover the origin, authority, and decline of the Sadducees.
Shalom, shalom. Thank you for joining us once again on your channel, La Mishnah TV. On this occasion, as we delve into the study of Parashah Tzav, we are confronted with this question: who truly controlled the spiritual heart of Israel during the biblical era and the period of the Second Temple in Jerusalem, the sages or the powerful? When one enters the world of the Second Temple, one tends to think of faith, sacrifices, and priests. Yet it is rarely stated clearly that this system was also permeated by politics, power, and ideological struggle. And that is where the Sadducees emerge. They were not the common people. They were not the popular teachers. They were the priestly elite, linked to the temple, to wealth, and to institutional control. Their name is associated with Zadok, the ancient priest from the era of Solomon, a connection that lent them historical legitimacy. Yet their true power did not stem solely from lineage. It derived from their control over the cult. For whoever controls the altar controls the nation. The Sadducees rose to power within a pivotal context, the Hasmonean period. In the wake of the Maccabean revolt, political and religious leadership merged. The high priests were no longer merely spiritual figures, they were also rulers. And within this sphere, the Sadducees consolidated their position as the temple's ruling class. Their authority? Absolute, at least within the sacrificial system. They administered the sacrifices, oversaw the rituals, controlled the temple's revenues, and defined, in practice, how the law was enacted in its most visible dimension, the cult. But here lies the tension. While the people followed the Pharisees, who developed the oral tradition and brought the Torah closer to daily life, the Sadducees championed a rigid stance. Only the written Torah is valid. No oral tradition. No accumulated interpretations, no flexibility, and, even more provocatively, they did not believe in the resurrection nor in judgment after death. In other words, they eliminated from the equation two pillars that would later be central to Rabbinic Judaism. So, what did they truly represent? They represented a Judaism centered on the temple as an institution, rather than on the spiritual transformation of the individual. A system in which holiness was bound to ritual, and ritual to power. And this is where everything connects directly with the Parashah of Tzav. For Tzav is not an abstract text. It is an operational manual for the priesthood. It establishes the laws regarding the burnt offering, the sin offering, and the peace offering. It defines how the fire on the altar must be maintained, how the portions are to be distributed, and what the priests may and may not eat. And it culminates with the consecration of Aaron and his sons, the very origin of the priestly system. Now, consider this with clarity. That entire system described in Tzav, centuries later, lay in the hands of the Sadducees. They were the enforcers of those laws. They determined how they were to be observed. In practice, they embodied that priestly model. Yet, while Tzav presents a divine ideal of service, discipline, and holiness, the history of the Second Temple reveals how that very same system can morph into a structure of power. And that is the uncomfortable question that opens this lesson. Was the priesthood always a conduit for holiness? Or, at some point, did it transform into an instrument of control? This is Abel Flores, investigative journalist and founder of La Mishnah TV. I invite you to stay with us until the very end of this lesson, and remember to subscribe to the channel, give us a like, and visit us on our website, lemishnah.com. There is a silence in history that is unsettling, and that silence has a name: the Sadducees. Contrary to what many believe, very little is actually known about the Sadducees, and the existing sources are not entirely reliable for a multitude of reasons. When we speak of Second Temple Judaism, we tend to imagine intense debates, schools of thought, and interpretations of the law. Yet, a fascinating paradox emerges here. One of the most influential groups of its time, left behind not a single written line of its own. And so, the inevitable question arises: how do we reconstruct the identity of those who did not speak directly for themselves? The origins of the Sadducees constitute, in effect, one of the most complex problems in all of Jewish historiography. Unlike the Pharisees or the Essenes, whose voices we can trace, however partially, through texts and traditions, the Sadducees reach us always filtered, interpreted, and quite often criticized. Our primary source is Flavius Josephus, a 1st century CE historian, a brilliant man, yet one whose perspective was shaped by his Roman context and his own personal leanings. Added to this is the New Testament, in which the Sadducees appear not as subjects of study, but rather as interlocutors engaged in theological tension. And finally, there is later rabbinic literature, the intellectual heir to Pharisaic thought, which does not always portray them sympathetically. Do you see it? We are reconstructing the Sadducees based on voices that, in many cases, were at odds with them. It is akin to attempting to understand a thinker by reading only their critics. This is where the researcher, and indeed the serious student, must pause and reflect consciously. Not everything that is said is neutral. Not every description is objective. And yet, within this interplay of mirrors, something true can be glimpsed. We know, for instance, that the Sadducees were linked to the priestly elite, that they maintained a unique relationship with the temple in Jerusalem, and that they held distinct views on key issues such as the resurrection or the authority of oral tradition. But beyond the data, what we truly face is a methodological and almost philosophical challenge. How do we listen to a voice that has not been preserved? And herein lies a profound lesson, even for our modern lives. Not only in history, but also in everyday life, we often form opinions based on third-party accounts. We judge, we define, we label, without ever having listened directly. The case of the Sadducees invites us to embrace an ethics of knowledge, to learn to doubt intelligently, to read with an eye for context, and to recognize that all historical truth is, in part, a reconstruction. For sometimes, what matters most is not merely what we know, but rather how we know what we believe we know. There are names that do not merely identify, they lay claim to power, and Sadducees is one of them. When we pronounce the Hebrew word Saddukim, we are not dealing with a simple historical label. We are, in reality, facing a carefully constructed ideological statement. And here begins the fascinating game of etymology. The most widely accepted hypothesis leads us directly to a single root, Zadok. Now, who was Zadok? The biblical text tells us, in 1 Kings 2 verse 35, that Zadok was a priest during the time of King Solomon. But not just any priest. Rather, one who consolidated his position during a delicate political moment, replacing Abiathar and establishing a priestly lineage that, according to tradition, enjoyed divine legitimacy. This is where history ceases to be mere narrative and becomes an argument. If the Tzaddukim derive their name from Zadok, then they are not simply saying, we belong to a certain group. They are asserting, we come from the correct lineage. In fact, in Hebrew, the root *tzedek* means justice or righteousness. A coincidence? Hardly. It is as if the name itself were insinuating, we represent the authentic justice of the cult. And then we grasp something deeper. This etymology is not merely linguistic, it is political. For in the context of the Second Temple, where various groups vied for religious authority, declaring, we are descendants of Zadok, was tantamount to declaring, we are the legitimate priests. It is not an opinion, it is a power play. Imagine the impact of this on the daily life of Jerusalem. Whoever controlled the priesthood controlled the temple, and whoever controlled the temple controlled the spiritual, economic, and social heart of the people. That is why the name Sadducees functions as a silent manifesto. They did not need to write treatises. Their very identity was, in itself, an argument. And here emerges a lesson that transcends centuries. In our modern lives, too, we encounter names, titles, and credentials, elements that do not merely describe, but seek to legitimize authority. Institutions, surnames, official positions, all construct narratives of legitimacy. The question, then, remains profoundly relevant. Does authority stem from lineage or from truth? The Sadducees compel us to look beyond words and to ask ourselves what lies behind every name that lays claim to power. Now, let us understand this. There are moments in history when an idea has not yet been born, yet the stage that will make it inevitable is already being set. And that is exactly what occurs during the Persian period between the 6th and 4th centuries BCE. After the exile in Babylon, the people of Israel returned to their land bearing an open wound, but also a unique opportunity. The temple in Jerusalem is rebuilt, and with it, not only does a building return, but an entire way of life. For in ancient Judaism, the temple was not merely a place of worship. It was the spiritual, political, and economic heart of the nation. And here, a silent yet decisive shift takes place. During this period, religious authority begins to concentrate in a central figure, the high priest. There is no longer a Davidic king on the throne. Political and spiritual leadership begin to merge within the priestly sphere. In other words, the one who officiates at the altar also influences the organization of the people. Little by little, a stable priestly class takes shape, one possessing real power. They administer not only sacrifices, but also resources, communal decisions, and relations with the Persian Empire, which govern using a clever strategy, granting religious autonomy in exchange for political loyalty. Do you see it? It is not merely religion, it is structure. And like any structure that concentrates power, it begins to generate elites, priestly families that accumulate influence, prestige, and, of course, wealth. Here, in this fertile ground, we do not yet see the Sadducees as a defined group, but we can already perceive their roots. For when they eventually appear centuries later, they will not emerge out of thin air. They will be the natural expression of this consolidated priestly class, a class that views the temple not merely as a sacred space, but as the very center of legitimate authority. It is like planting a tree. For years, we see no fruit, yet the roots are already working silently beneath the surface. And here emerges a lesson that transcends history. Great movements are not born overnight. They take shape within contexts, within structures, and within decisions that seem small yet redefine the future. The same holds true in our modern lives. The ideas that will dominate tomorrow are being sown today, often without our even noticing. The Persian period reminds us of something essential. Before an ideology acquires a name, a system already exists that makes it possible. There are conquests that do not destroy temples, but rather transform minds. And the arrival of the Greek world in Judea is one such instance. With the incursion of Alexander the Great in the 4th century BC, it was not only the political map that changed. Language, education, and philosophy changed as well. In a word, the very way of thinking. Judea entered into a profound process of Hellenization. Now, Greek culture was not superficial. It brought with it theater, gymnasiums, logic, aesthetics, and a worldview centered on the human being. In contrast, the Jewish tradition upheld something radically different, a life defined by the Torah, by the covenant, and by the sacred. And so, inevitably, tension arose. It was not merely a cultural conflict. It was an existential question. To what extent can we adapt without ceasing to be who we are? In this context, the priesthood, already a powerful institution since the Persian period, began to undergo even further transformation. It was no longer solely a spiritual role. It became a political position, and, like any political position, it began to be negotiable. History offers us a compelling example. During the Seleucid rule, the high priesthood was literally sold to the highest bidder. Men like Jason and Menelaus did not attain the office through lineage or spiritual merit, but rather through their ability to negotiate with the imperial power. Imagine the impact of this. The most sacred office of the people of Israel reduced to an economic transaction. This is where the problem ceases to be external and becomes internal. For it is no longer solely about Greek influence, but about how certain Jewish elites adopted that very logic. The priesthood began to align itself more with political and economic interests than with the purity of divine service. And in that process, a distinct elite began to take shape, sophisticated, powerful, integrated into the dominant system, yet increasingly distant from the original spiritual ideal. Does this sound familiar? For this phenomenon does not belong solely to antiquity. Today, too, we observe how institutions born with a lofty purpose can, over time, gravitate toward power, influence, and expediency. The Hellenistic period leaves us with a clear and profound warning. When the sacred becomes negotiable, it ceases to be sacred. And it is precisely within this climate, one of tension, adaptation, and, at times, corruption, that the group we would later come to know as the Sadducees would begin to take shape with greater clarity. Not as an anomaly, but as the logical outcome of a system that had shifted its priorities. There are moments in history when a crisis not only alters the course of events, but redefines who has the right to lead. And that is exactly what occurred in the 2nd century BCE with the Maccabean revolt. At first glance, one might assume this was simply a rebellion against Seleucid oppression. And yes, it was. But at its deepest core, this crisis was a struggle for identity, for legitimacy, and for control over the sacred. The Maccabean family, the Hasmoneans, achieved something extraordinary. They not only expelled foreign influence, but also seized both political and religious power in Judea. And here lies the turning point. For, until that moment, there existed a clear expectation. The priesthood was required to descend from the line of Zadok, that ancient root representing historical legitimacy and sacred continuity. But the Hasmoneans did not belong to that line, and yet they seized control of the high priesthood. Do you see it? This is no minor detail. It represents a structural rupture. For the first time, religious leadership no longer rested exclusively upon inherited tradition, but rather upon political and military might. The sword began to vie with genealogy, and within this landscape, the pivotal conflict emerged, one that would shape the future of Judaism. On one side, we find an aristocratic priestly group, what we might term the proto-Sadducees, who accepted and even supported this new order. For them, the stability of power and control over the temple justified their alliance with the Hasmonean dynasty. On the other side, more populous sectors emerged, the proto-Pharisees, who began to challenge this legitimacy, not necessarily through armed rebellion, but through the interpretation of the law, oral tradition, and religious ethics. It is, in essence, a dispute over the very soul of Judaism. Who defines what is right? The established power or fidelity to tradition? And so, almost without anyone officially declaring it, the Sadducees began to consolidate their position as the priestly elite backing the Hasmonean power. They were not merely a theological group, they were a ruling class, aligned with the government, invested in preserving order, and, of course, their own standing. Here, history offers us an uncomfortable yet necessary lesson. When political power and religious authority merge without clear boundaries, the question of legitimacy never disappears. It only becomes more urgent. And in our contemporary world, this tension remains very much alive. For that delicate balance between tradition, power, and truth will always exist. And true wisdom lies in not conflating them, even when they walk side by side. There comes a moment when a group ceases to be merely a trend and becomes a system. And for the Sadducees, that moment arrives during the Hasmonean period. Between the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE, what was once merely a priestly current begins to consolidate itself as a genuine ruling class. We are no longer speaking of diffuse influence, but of structural control. For the Sadducees come to occupy the very heart of power, the temple in Jerusalem. Let us pause here for a moment. The temple was not merely a spiritual space. It was a complex institution, one might almost say, a nerve center of society. Sacrifices were indeed performed there, but resources were also managed. Priestly rotations were organized, offerings were channeled, and the religious life of the people was regulated. Whoever controlled the temple administered not only the faith, but also the economy. And that is exactly what the Sadducees do. They become the dominant priestly class. They oversee rituals, direct the sacrificial system, and manage the economic resources linked to the cult. Their authority is not symbolic. It is operational, daily, and concrete. But power never exists in isolation. And here, the second key element emerges, the political alliance. The Sadducees support the Hasmonean rulers, cementing a mutually beneficial relationship. Political power requires religious legitimacy, and the priestly elite requires stability to maintain its position. It is a delicate balance, yet an effective one. And when Rome later enters the scene, this logic does not vanish, it adapts. The Sadducees, pragmatists by nature, collaborate with the Roman administration, not necessarily out of ideological conviction, but out of a clear understanding of power. Survival entails negotiation. Do you see it? We are not dealing with a group isolated within theological debates. We are facing an institutional elite, perfectly integrated into the structures of government and the economy. Their power is not merely religious. It is political, it is administrative, it is economic. And here emerges a reflection that spans the centuries. When religion becomes deeply institutionalized, it runs the risk of becoming conflated with the power that sustains it. And so, the question ceases to be solely, what is truth? To become, what maintains the system? In our contemporary reality, this tension remains very much alive. Institutions, leaders, structures, all face the same challenge: to serve the original purpose or to preserve acquired power. The Sadducees show us that when these two things intermingle, the result can be highly efficient, yet also profoundly complex from a spiritual standpoint. For not everything that endures through time necessarily endures in truth. There is an idea that makes us uncomfortable, yet one that history confirms time and again. Beliefs do not always descend from the heavens. Quite often, they emerge from the position we occupy here on earth. When we look at the Sadducees, their theology does not appear as an abstract, pure, and isolated system. Rather, it emerges as a direct reflection of their place in society, a priestly elite, inextricably linked to the temple, to institutional power, and to the concrete administration of the sacred. And from that vantage point, everything begins to make sense. One of the most characteristic features of their thought is their rejection of oral tradition. Unlike other groups, most notably the Pharisees, the Sadducees maintained that only the written Torah, the fixed, defined, and closed text, possessed true authority. No cumulative interpretations, no expansive debates, no additional layers of meaning, only the text. Now, at first glance, this might appear to be a stance of doctrinal purity, a sort of return to the essentials. But when we analyze it within its historical context, we uncover another dimension entirely. For oral tradition, as developed by the Pharisees, democratized access to knowledge. It allowed the law to be interpreted, debated, and adapted to new realities. In other words, it opened up the playing field. Conversely, limiting authority solely to the written Torah, which was guarded and enforced from within the temple, had a very concrete effect. It centralized power. Less interpretation meant fewer authoritative voices to do the interpreting, and fewer voices implied greater control on the part of those who already occupied the dominant position. Do you see it? It is not merely theology, it is a power structure expressed in religious language. From this perspective, the Sadducee stance ceases to be a simple doctrinal disagreement and becomes, instead, a strategy entirely consistent with their identity. They had no need to multiply interpretations. What they needed was to preserve a system in which their authority remained clear, stable, and, above all, difficult to challenge. And here, a lesson of profound contemporary relevance emerges. Even today, in various spheres, religious, academic, political, we encounter tensions between interpretation and control, between openness and centralization, between living tradition and closed text. The question the Sadducees compel us to ask ourselves is uncomfortable, yet necessary. Do we defend an idea because it is true, or because it upholds our position? For ultimately, theology, like so many other things in life, reveals not only what we believe, but also the standpoint from which we believe. There are beliefs that elevate the human being toward the transcendent, and there are others that anchor him firmly in the present. The Sadducees, according to our sources, clearly chose the latter option. Flavius Josephus, our primary voice, albeit not a neutral one, describes a surprisingly sober, almost austere theology. He tells us that they did not believe in the resurrection of the dead. That is to say, they denied the idea that human history continues beyond death through an act of divine restoration. Nor did they accept the active existence of angels. And here it is important to clarify. They did not necessarily deny everything spiritual. but they certainly rejected a cosmology populated by celestial intermediaries constantly intervening in human life. And even more radically, they rejected the very notion of an afterlife. Let us pause for a moment, for this is no minor detail. It represents a complete redefinition of the religious experience. While other groups within Second Temple Judaism were developing ideas regarding future reward, judgment, Olam Haba, the world to come, the Sadducees concentrated all significance on the here and now. Life is this, the stage is this, the responsibility likewise. Now, when we connect this theology with its social context, something begins to fall into place. We are speaking of a priestly elite that already possesses power, influence, and stability. It has no need to project justice onto an eschatological future because, to a large extent, it already experiences a form of order in the present. For those who suffer, the idea of a world to come offers solace. For those already at the pinnacle, it may prove unnecessary. Do you see it? Theology once again reflects one's position. An approach centered on the earthly realm is not merely a philosophical stance. It is also a means of legitimizing the present exactly as it stands. If there is no resurrection, there is no reversal of roles. If there is no future judgment, the current order acquires a kind of implicit permanence. And yet, here emerges a deeply human tension. For even in our own time, we continue to debate the very same thing. Do we live solely for the present, or are we part of a larger story that transcends us? The Sadducees teach us, perhaps without intending to, that our beliefs about the hereafter reveal much about how we understand the here and now. And the question remains open, like an echo reverberating across the centuries. If everything ends here, what do we do with that need for justice that we do not always see fulfilled? There is a place in history where heaven and earth seem to touch, and that place, for the Sadducees, had a specific address, the temple in Jerusalem. To understand their vision, we must momentarily set aside our modern notion of inner spirituality. In their world, the sacred was not an abstraction. It was a practice, an act, a living system enacted every single day. And at the center of that system lay sacrificial worship. Animals offered, fire kindled, blood spilled with ritual precision, not as a primitive gesture, but as a deeply structured symbolic language. Each sacrifice represented drawing near, atonement, *kesher*, a bond between the human being and the divine. And this is where the Sadducees find their center. For if the temple is the primary conduit of holiness, then those who administer it are not merely religious functionaries. They are indispensable mediators between God and the people. Holiness, in their view, does not circulate freely. It is channeled. And that channel has a name, the priesthood. This connects directly to the book of Leviticus, particularly in sections such as Tzav. There, we read meticulous instructions regarding the sacrifices, the fire that must never be extinguished, and the purity of the altar. A perpetual fire shall burn on the altar. It shall not go out. Leviticus 6 verse 6. This verse is not merely a technical command. It is a declaration of permanence. The relationship with the divine requires constancy, structure, and care. And the Sadducees embody precisely that vision. For them, Judaism does not rest upon open-ended interpretations or abstract theoretical developments. It rests upon the continuity of ritual, the precision of service, and the centrality of the temple as the sole legitimate space for encountering God. Do you see it? It is a profoundly institutional model. Spiritual experience does not depend on individual subjectivity, but rather on participation in an ordered, regulated system, one that is, of course, administered by a priestly elite. And here emerges a reflection that transcends time. Even today, we continue to oscillate between two poles, a structured spirituality, with its forms, rituals, and authorities, and a spirituality that is more interior, more personal, more interpretive. The Sadducees remind us of the power, and also the risk, of concentrating the sacred in a single place, within a single system. For when access to the divine passes exclusively through a structure, that structure becomes indispensable. And the question, then, continues to resonate with force. Does the temple bring human beings closer to God, or does it make them dependent upon those who control it? Perhaps, as in so many things, The answer lies not in choosing one extreme, but in understanding the tension. There is a silent tension between the ideal and history, and rarely does it become as visible as when we read the Parashah Tzav. In Leviticus 6 through 8, the Torah presents us with an almost perfect model of the priesthood, not as an institution of power, but as sacred service. Detailed therein are the priestly functions, the laws of the sacrifices, and one of the most solemn moments in the entire tradition, the consecration of Aaron and his sons. Everything is carefully ordered. Every action makes sense. Every gesture carries intent. The priest, in this context, does not dominate, he serves. He does not accumulate power, he channels holiness. Listen to the implicit language: discipline, purity, continuity. A continuous fire shall burn upon the altar, it shall not be extinguished. That fire does not represent human control, it represents constant divine presence. And yet, as we move forward in history toward the period of the Second Temple, we encounter something unsettling. That very same priestly model does not vanish, it becomes institutionalized. The Sadducees, as the dominant priestly class, embody the historical realization of that system. They are, in a sense, the visible heirs of what Tzav describes in its ideal form. But here lies the key difference, one that is fundamental to grasp. In Tzav, the priesthood is a vocation of service. In the Second Temple era, under Sadducean hegemony, that priesthood also becomes a structure of power. The same altar, but with a different dynamic. The same fire, but in a different context. What is a mission in the Torah can, in history, transform into an institution. And what begins as service can, over time, become intertwined with political, economic, and social interests. Do you notice it? We are not speaking of an overt betrayal, but rather of a gradual transformation. For no one wakes up one day saying, "I am going to corrupt the sacred." It happens far more subtly. The system grows, organizes itself, becomes efficient, and, almost without our realizing it, power begins to occupy the space of purpose. And here emerges a lesson that belongs not only to the past. Even today, in our communities, in our institutions, in our own lives, we face this very same tension. Are we serving that which is sacred, or are we using the sacred to sustain structures? The Parashah Tzav shows us the ideal, the Sadducees, the concrete reality, and between the two lies a bridge that we must cross with mindfulness. For keeping the fire burning is not the same thing as remembering why it was kindled in the first place. There is something every good researcher learns sooner or later. History is constructed not only from facts, but also from prejudices. And in the case of the Sadducees, this principle becomes especially evident. For almost everything we know about them comes from their opponents, Pharisaic sources, later rabbinic literature, and even Christian texts. In other words, we are reading their history through eyes that, in many cases, were not exactly neutral. The result? A series of myths repeated so often that they eventually come to seem like truths. But today, let's do something different. Not to defend the Sadducees, but to understand them with greater precision. First myth. They were simply materialists devoid of spirituality. This idea stems from the fact that they denied the resurrection and life after death. But reducing them to mere materialists is an oversimplification. Their approach did not eliminate the sacred, it concentrated it in the present, in the temple, in the ritual act. They did not deny God. They denied certain interpretations regarding the afterlife. Second myth. They were corrupt without exception. Yes, there were documented cases of corruption, particularly in the context of the priesthood being bought and sold during the Hellenistic period. But turning that into an absolute characteristic of the entire group is historically unfair. We are looking at a complex elite, not a moral caricature. Third myth. They were ignorant of the law. Quite the opposite. They were specialists in the written Torah. Their disagreement with the Pharisees was not due to a lack of knowledge, but rather a methodological difference. They rejected the oral tradition as a source of authority. It is not ignorance. It is a distinct hermeneutical stance. Fourth myth. They were enemies of the people. Here, the issue is more nuanced. They represented an elite, yes, and that created a distance between them and the common people. Yet they also maintained the functioning of the temple, which was central to the collective life of the community. Their relationship with the people was not one of simple antagonism, but but rather of structural tension. Do you see it? Every myth contains a spark of truth, yet it is distorted by the lens of the one who conveys it. And here emerges a lesson that completely transcends the realm of history. Even today, we live surrounded by narratives constructed upon oppositions, political, religious, and cultural, and often we inherit opinions without ever questioning their origins. The case of the Sadducees invites us to adopt a more mature way of thinking, not to automatically accept the dominant narrative, yet neither to reject it without analysis, to learn to read between the lines, to distinguish between fact and interpretation, to recognize that even criticisms may contain a measure of truth, though not the whole truth. For ultimately, understanding history is not about choosing a side. It is about learning to listen even to those who left behind no voice of their own. There are silences that are not an absence, but a challenge. And the Sadducees, perhaps more than any other group of the Second Temple period, compel us to reflect not only on what we know, but on the limits of our knowledge. For their case is not merely historical, it is profoundly epistemological. It confronts us with an uncomfortable question. What do we do when the sources exist, yet the original voice has vanished? Let us begin with the most unsettling enigma, the total absence of their own texts. Unlike the Pharisees, whose oral tradition eventually crystallized in the Talmud, or the Essenes, who left us the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Sadducees left behind not a single document that can be identified with certainty. No treatises, no commentaries, no doctrinal statements, nothing. And this changes everything. For then, everything we think we know about them derives from Flavius Josephus, from rabbinic literature, and from the texts of the New Testament. That is to say, from their adversaries. Imagine attempting to reconstruct a thinker by reading solely those who argued against him. The problem is critical. We do not know how they define themselves. We do not know how they justify their positions. And, perhaps most importantly, we do not know their theology in their own voice. Let us turn to the second mystery. Were they truly descendants of Zadok? The name Saddukim seems to suggest as much. And, as we have seen, Zadok was a priest in the time of Solomon. But here, history becomes ambiguous. There is no direct genealogical proof. Thus, two fascinating possibilities emerge. Perhaps they were indeed actual descendants, bearers of an ancient priestly legitimacy. Or perhaps they symbolically appropriated the name as a strategy to assert authority. In other words, lineage or narrative. And the historical record, quite honestly, does not allow us to reach a definitive conclusion. The third enigma, their true theology. We know a fair amount about what they rejected. They rejected the resurrection. They rejected the oral Torah. But knowing what someone denies is not the same as understanding what they affirm. How did they interpret the ambiguous passages of the Torah? What did they understand by the term soul? How did they conceive of divine justice without a world to come? Here, we enter speculative territory, and the serious scholar must acknowledge this with humility. We do not possess a complete, precisely reconstructed theological system. And finally, the fourth mystery, their relationship with other groups, particularly the Essenes. Some scholars have suggested that the Essenes may have been dissident priests, expelled from, or self-exiled from, the temple system, perhaps in conflict with a ruling elite, possibly Sadducean. The hypothesis is elegant. It accounts for internal tensions, ritual differences, and even their withdrawal into the desert. But, and this is crucial, there is no definitive consensus. It is plausible, but unproven. And here, at the end of this journey, a lesson emerges that reaches far beyond the Sadducees. Human knowledge is not absolute. It is a careful reconstruction, sometimes fragmentary, always provisional. The Sadducees teach us something that few historical subjects manage to convey with such force. Not everything of importance leaves behind clear traces, and not every absence is a void. Sometimes, it is an invitation to think more deeply. For understanding history is not merely a matter of accumulating certainties. It is learning to live with questions that, perhaps, will never be fully answered. There are questions that history poses, yet never fully answers. And when we turn to the Sadducees, those questions become even sharper, almost unsettling. We know that they controlled the temple. We know that they held influence within the Sanhedrin. But when we descend to the level of daily life, the terrain becomes uncertain. To what extent did they truly hold sway over the people? Were they feared, respected, or simply tolerated as part of the system? Here, the historian pauses. For institutional power does not always equate to total social control. It is possible that they were influential within the structure, yet more distant from the daily experience of ordinary people. And then we move on to another delicate point, their relationship with Rome. We know that they collaborated. They maintained stability. They knew how to adapt to the new imperial order. But the question remains open. Were they convinced allies, or simply pragmatists? Did they act with autonomy, or did they rely on Roman power to sustain their position? The line between cooperation and subordination is, as is often the case, dangerously blurred. And then, the most dramatic mystery of all, the year 70 AD, the destruction of the temple, and with it, the almost total disappearance of the Sadducees. No texts, no visible continuity, no school to carry on their thought. Unlike the Pharisees, who evolved into rabbinic Judaism, the Sadducees seem simply to vanish. Did they dissolve? Did they integrate into other groups? Did they persist in forms that we can no longer identify? Silence prevails once again, but perhaps one of the most subtle and most fascinating enigmas is a methodological one. They rejected oral tradition. They asserted the exclusive authority of the written Torah. But here, an inevitable, almost technical, question arises. How does one live by a law without interpreting it? The Torah, by its very nature, requires application, adaptation, and decision-making. No legal system functions without hermeneutics. So, how did they resolve the gaps? Did they possess an interpretive tradition of their own that went undocumented? Did they apply a strictly literal reading? We do not know for certain. And finally, we arrive at the deepest mystery, not a historical one, but one almost spiritual in nature. The tension between the ideal and reality. The Torah, especially in texts such as Tzav, presents us with a priesthood defined as sacred service, a system oriented toward holiness, wherein human beings approach the divine with humility and precision. Yet, in concrete historical reality, the Sadducees embodied that very same system within a context of political power, economic interests, and institutional control. And so, the question ceases to be academic and becomes universal. At what moment does service transform into power? At what point does the sacred begin to prop up structures rather than transcend them? For this is not merely the mystery of the Sadducees. It is the mystery of every human institution. And perhaps, if we are honest, it is our own mystery as well. Every time we take something born of purpose and turn it into a position. Every time we protect the system rather than remembering its true meaning. The Sadducees vanished from history, but the tension they embodied remains absolutely alive. After traversing this entire journey, the conclusion is clear and, at the same time, uncomfortable. The Sadducees were neither a marginal group nor a mere forgotten sect. They were the priestly elite that controlled the spiritual heart of Israel during the most decisive moment in its history, the Second Temple period. Their power was not theoretical, it was real. They administered the cult, the altar, the sacrifices. In other words, they administered access to the sacred. Their origins were not accidental. They emerged from the convergence of priestly lineage, political crisis, and historical opportunity. From the heritage associated with Zadok, through the era of Hellenization, to their consolidation under the Hasmoneans, the Sadducees represent the institutionalization of the priesthood. But here lies the critical point. While the Torah, particularly in the Parashah Tzav, presents an ideal model of priesthood grounded in service, discipline, and holiness, the Sadducees embodied that system within the realm of actual history, where worship becomes inextricably intertwined with power. They were not irreligious. They were not ignorant. They were not an anomaly. They were a coherent, yet incomplete, expression of Judaism, a model that absolutizes the temple, ritual, and centralized authority, while diminishing spiritual growth, dynamic interpretation, and eschatological hope. And for this very reason, they came into tension with the Pharisees. Ultimately, their demise was not ideological, but structural. When the temple fell in 70 CE, their world vanished along with it. Without the altar, there is no system. Without the system, there are no Sadducees. And here remains the most profound lesson. The Sadducees compel us to confront a question that transcends their own era. What happens when a structure designed to serve God ends up consolidating human power? For at that point, religion ceases to be merely faith and becomes an institution. And when that happens, history shows that the problem is not the system itself, but rather who controls it. Thank you so much for sticking with us to the end. This is Abel Flores, founder of La Mishnah TV. I invite you to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, to give us a like, and to visit us at our website, lemishnah.com, where you will find a wealth of additional information on all these topics, as well as our free course covering the entire Mishnah. I've also included a couple of videos here that you won't want to miss if you'd like to continue studying with us.